right, hey, this is Miss Cisco. I am recording this video as my audio of the notes for contemporary poetry and Minh, Nguyen. So I first want to start with a conversation of what does someone mean when they say contemporary poetry? And actually, it has two meanings. So it actually depends. So there are two different meanings of contemporary poetry. The first is simply anyone who's been writing recently compared to where we are now. And it has to do with the period of time that is closest to our own. For example, we can say that there are Victorian poets, industrial, modern, and contemporary, which are more recent over the past 150 years. But on the other hand, contemporary can also be seen as a style of poetry that is written today. And with this, we can divide poets up into four groups. We can categorize them into four groups: traditional, modern, postmodern, and contemporary. And also, sometimes people divide it into two groups, traditional and modern, or traditional and contemporary. But we're going to stick with the four that are highlighted on this slide, and I'm going to briefly talk about each of them. So traditional poets typically write in a traditional fixed verse. An example of this, that's a very obvious one, would be Shakespeare, and he is very famous for writing sonnets. And that has both meter and rhyme. So that is what we would refer to as a fixed verse, something that has something like meter and rhyme in a very specific form. And most traditional poets, although not all, are historically further back from where we are today, such as Shakespeare. On the other hand, modern poetry was kind of a movement against that. So typically modern poetry does have very specific diction and rhythm, similarly to the traditional poets, but it is not metrical, and it is not as strictly metrical as a traditional poem might be. On this slide, there are some bullet points about what modernism is. I think an important thing to note is the historical context. The term modernism referring to the movement that began in the late 1800s and beginning with World War I and continuing to be influential after World War II. And that was obviously a very, very big historical shift, which led to a big literary shift. A pretty big example that's very different from the traditional poets is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I included part of it. It's a very long poem, but you can see here just from the excerpt that's on the screen that it is first of all, it looks very different from what a sonnet in a traditional poem might look like. Now, postmodern is the next one we're going to talk about. So postmodern poetry emphasizes the role of the poet, the role of the reader, and highlights the cultural place that the poem is read. And then the poem itself is seen as a cultural artifact. And postmodern is a little more difficult to nail down because it was a time of experimentation in writing. And also the more classical and non-classical poetry kind of can exist side by side within this genre. And it kind of just like throws everything for a loop. I put an example by Lawrence Ferlingetti, an excerpt from Bird with Two Wings, and you can see that very differently from the sonnet on the first page and even J. Alfred Prufrock on the second page, there is no meter in this one. And now our government, a bird with two wings, flies on from zone to zone while we go on having our little fun and games. So there's no rhyme, there's not necessarily a meter there, and the line lengths are certainly not even. So again, a very big shift from the other two movements. And then the last one, which is the one that we're going to focus on today, is contemporary poetry, which typically moves back towards traditional forms, but it also may include other characteristics. So like we talked about with the historical poetry movements, many of them are reactions to each other. So traditional poetry was a certain way, and then modern poetry kind of went other direction. And then postmodern was like, nah, I'm gonna go do my own thing. And now contemporary poetry kind of is reaching back to the traditional poetry, but not imitating it specifically. So usually contemporary poetry is written in free verse, which is unrhymed and has no specific metrical rhythm. And it is brief, and it also has a lot of images that use all the reader's senses, concrete imagery, which we've talked a lot about. And It also is more subtle. So it invites the reader to interpret the poem without yelling from the rooftops the true meaning. Like, for instance, in a sonnet, you might have a couplet at the end that kind of summarizes what the entire poem means, whereas in contemporary poetry, it's more subtle. All right, so let's talk about Nguyen. So Nguyen is a queer Vietnamese American poet and performer. Yes, he's still alive. And he is the poetry editor for a magazine called Muzzle Magazine. He was an MFA candidate at Warren Wilson College. MFA stands for Master of Fine Arts, and this refers to a Masters of Fine Arts in Creative Writing specifically. And then his first collection of poems, This Way to the Sugar, was a finalist for multiple awards. And I included a picture of it as well. He has another collection that the name of it is escaping me currently, but his first one was This Way to the Sugar. So after learning this information, you are going to be working with the poem Changeling, which is a personal favorite of mine. It's particularly powerful and chock full of those concrete images that contemporary poetry loves. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy.